Hello everybody. So I thought I'd do something different with this video. Now I have some mixed feelings on video tutorials, and there's a problem that when you just follow a tutorial step by step, that the second a framework changes, then you need to do something that's not exactly what was done in the tutorial, it can be very hard then to adapt. And it's really hard, like software development and coding is a very hard thing to teach because of this. A lot of what you need to do is really you need to learn how to use documentation and how to fix problems. Now I have learned Laravel 7 is the version of Laravel that I learned, and I haven't really looked at Laravel 8 much, other than to look at it and think that I didn't really want to use Laravel 8 for teaching this year on the Swansea University Computer Science course. But I can tell a lot of people who are doing that course have been using Laravel 8 and have been coming across a few problems. And I thought there was an opportunity there for me to record myself learning Laravel 8, specifically the new way factories work. And so that's what I did. And instead of coding live, I just recorded my screen and set up this, this is how I work. So I thought I would talk through what I do. And so this video isn't just about learning how to use factories in Laravel 8. It's also about giving you some pointers and tips on how to be a developer, I think is probably not coding, but actually being a software developer. So first thing I want to show, before I start this going, the first thing to notice is that of my working environment, I have a really nice ultra-wide monitor. And on the left-hand side here, I have the API documentation open because I know I'm going to use it. I don't memorize things, right? I'm always Googling, I'm always looking at documentation. Always do that, right? You should always be doing that. So let's start going here. So I started, basically what I'm showing you here is I'm starting with just going into my Vagrant. I've got Homestead set up, so I'm working in Vagrant. Well, I've used Vagrant to set up Homestead, and that's my development environment here. And my goal was to make a simple application that is like a to-do list, and it's the kind of go-to web application that I use to try and remember these things, to try and kind of test out a new framework. It's like, make a to-do list. And right off the bat here, even though I create Laravel new Laravel projects fair amount when I'm doing teaching, I do always forget the command. So I'm always looking stuff up in the documentation. And then while I'm looking this stuff up, while I'm waiting for Laravel to install, I realized I'd forgotten to actually create a new project in my YAML file for Homestead. So I was kind of doing that while everything was downloading on the virtual machine. You can see here that actually I got an error when I ran that command, which kind of stumped me a little bit. But then I thought, well, I know I could just use Composer directly. I'd done that earlier in the day and I knew that worked. So I don't know why this didn't work. I think something to do with the way that Laravel is served through that command versus Composer. So I just tried Composer and that worked. Well, it worked once I had the correct name, because I just copy and pasted that command then. But I needed to change it to just to do. The other thing that I realized I'd forgotten to do is set up my hosts file on Windows, so that when I went to, I wanted to set it up so that I had this to-do list project on todo.test. So I needed to change my hosts file, which is what I'm doing here. And again, while I'm waiting for this to load, I'm starting to think about what I'm going to need to get started. So my basic plan was to set up a simple situation where I've got two models. I wasn't going to do a front end. I just wanted to get factories working. So I'm getting the documentation I'm going to need ready and thinking about my design as I'm installing stuff that takes a while. And then I realized that because I changed my YAML file, I need to kill my virtual machine and then bring it back up with the provision argument to make Vagrant check the homestead file, that configuration file, to make for any changes that I made. And here I'm trying to remind myself, actually, trying to remember how I need to set up my environment file in the Laravel project. So now that the virtual machine's up, then I know everything is ready to go. So I'm just opening up the folder for the application that I made, so which is in the to-do. It was the to-do folder there. I'm having to launch, just so I've got a terminal in this particular Visual Studio Code window, I'm having to log in to the virtual machine again there. And then I'm just setting up the environment file in the homestead, in the Laravel project, sorry. And then I'm setting up another browser here, which is going to be where eventually I want to test that everything's working. So the first thing I always do with the Laravel project is make sure that that home page is working, and then I know everything's set up correctly. I'm also here making sure that my console is set to disable the cache. So originally my plan was to look at actually creating some views and stuff, but then I figured I wanted to get to know the new factory stuff, so I didn't get around to it. But it's a good thing, a good practice to, when you're doing web development, have that cache disabled. But whatever browser you're using, you'll have some way of doing that. So Google it. Here I'm trying to remind myself all the commands in Artisan, because I need to create a model and I want to make sure I do it correctly first time. So rather than rely on my memory, I'm just doing Artisan list to get a list of all the different commands here. So my first step is I'm going to make a ToDo model. And here I'm pretty, like, I'm thinking, oh, I'm pretty sure there's a way of creating the model and the migration at the same time. Or I was perhaps checking the convention. So again, it's like I'm going to keep saying this and I'm going to not apologize for it. I don't memorize things and I'm always checking things. And you should all do that too. So the -m option that I put on after the to-do, that creates a migration as well. If you remember, the migrations where we kind of define the fields in our tables. So here's the to-do model, the PHP class it created. And then probably the first place that I usually go is to the migration file to add all of the fields that we want in our table. What I'm doing here is I'm realizing that I want to have a Boolean because it's a to-do, and I couldn't remember what the kind of eloquent command was for that. So a little bit of searching in the documentation here to find that. I think the key thing is, like you can see here, it does take me a while to find this, and don't be put off. Sometimes the documentation is it's hard to find exactly what you want, but it's so important to be comfortable working with this kind of documentation. So just stick at it. My general plan of attack when I'm searching documentation is to first look on the kind of more manual side. You usually find APIs, they've got one part which feels more like practically how are you coding, and then they always have like just a kind of raw API documentation where every method and like function is listed. But in this case I couldn't find it. So like, you know, I knew that it was somewhere. I knew that there was a table that I had seen this before, but it took me a while to find. Eventually, what I realized was that all of the stuff you do with tables is in migrations. So it was perhaps obviously in the migrations section on the documentation. So then now I'm just adding 2 fields to the to-do. So I'm going to add a Boolean, which tells you whether or not this is done or not. And also a description. Again, like this is kind of something I do to test, to just, it's an easy thing to just set up a to-do list, and it's like a classic, how do you make a to-do list in a particular web framework. And now I'm making the second model, and initially I want to call it list, but I will get an error in a second because the name list is reserved by PHP, so I can't use that. So then I had to kind of rethink my design. I ended up going with board. And then it's just a case that I was doing, so the same thing on board. So the design that I had was that a board will have multiple to-dos. So it's a one-to-many relationship. And so now I'm just reminding myself in the documentation how to do that correctly, to make sure I follow the right conventions. And what I was looking for here actually is how you define the foreign key in the database migration, because that's always the first step, is to set up all of the fields in your database migrations. Then you go on to implement the methods in the actual classes. So here I found, again, I found it in the database migration section, which again should have like made sense. So here what I'm doing is that I'm saying the to-do, a board will have many to-dos. So I need the foreign key, and in the case of Laravel 8, that's a foreign key is going to be an unsigned big integer. So I'm creating that, calling it board_ID, board being the model name that it's related to. And I make a mistake here when I create this referential constraint, which you'll see come up when we do the migration, but I will tell you it now. So I've said foreign key board ID references ID on board, whereas actually it should be boards plural. So the convention in Laravel is that models are singular and the tables are plural. So I needed to put in the actual table name there. And then I'm just adding the onDelete cascade constraint, and then I had again a memory fart and couldn't remember like how to do the on update, and it is literally just on update. I should have been confident enough. And this one I couldn't find in the documentation, I don't think, so I ended up actually going to my lecture notes and looking there. So if you've got access to my lecture notes, aren't you lucky? So what I'm doing here is I know that I'm going to need my boards table before my to-do table. Otherwise, that constraint will fail. So I need to make sure that the migrations happen in the correct order. And the way that you do that is by changing the date at the start of the file. So I now know that the migration is going to happen boards first, then the to-do table. And then what I'm doing here, like, is actually I'm enabling something called mass assignment, which is I'm letting Laravel know that there's certain fields in these models that I'm okay kind of being assigned automatically, and that's going to help me out later on with like doing factories. And but for security reasons, you don't want to make all of your everything assignable through mass assignment. So it really depends on your application. So here what I'm trying to do is I want to set the Boolean in the to-do to default to false, because we want to-dos to start out not done. And I firstly thought that was something you did in the migration file. But I found that actually you do it in the, you can do it in the model. So what this will do actually is it's not going to set, I didn't set the default value in the database definition, which I could do. This is actually just setting a default value in the Laravel model. So it gives a default when you create a new to do, it's going to automatically in the PHP class when it's created will automatically have a false value there. And so now again, I'm trying to just remember how to do the database migration. So I'm finding that. And I get that error, and I get an error, and this error is because of the board thing I mentioned before. So it takes me a while to notice this, but it's just a typo, or I forgot to pluralize board in the to-dos table migration. The thing to remember, so the way I kind of found the problem was because like I'm reading the SQL error here. Like, so sometimes you get so much error stuff, it can make you like, like you shot, like, oh God, I did everything right. Well, I followed the tutorial. Why isn't it working? And then if you look carefully, it says here, cannot add foreign key constraint. So I've only got one foreign key constraint that I've tried to add. So I know that's where the problem is. And so I'm just kind of like looking at backwards and forwards and kind of thinking, right, what's wrong? Something's wrong. I've done something wrong. Like I maybe think, oh, have I got the order of the migrations correct? That usually my first check. And then the next one is then to look in and I notice, I'm an idiot. Like I need to put an S on the end of boards. And there we go. So now it's done. And that's an example of like a bug where what you'll notice I didn't do is I didn't just randomly try things. Like I thought through the problem and figured out what was wrong before I changed any code. And if you don't do that, you end up just digging yourself a huge hole. So the next thing I want to do is I want to do seeding and like I want to do seeding using factories. And I know that this is different. I know this is something that has changed in Laravel 8. So I'm going to look a bit carefully at the documentation and read through it. Like I've got some knowledge from Laravel 7. So I'm just kind of scan reading it and trying to figure out what's changed. Specifically here, I'm trying to remind myself, like, do I need to create a seeder or do I create the factory first? So you notice I'm kind of like building up some tabs now in Chrome. I'm trying to keep all the little bits and pieces I need quick to access so I can flick through them. And I've got them there. So I decide that the first thing I'm going to do is make a seeder, but then I don't actually think I ever use this because of the way that you can do stuff now in Laravel 8. I didn't necessarily need it. I guess there's we'll talk about that. Like there's an argument. So what I end up doing is using the factory straight in just the overall database seeder class. Again, I'm just checking my notes to see as well, like what have I suggested doing in the past, just like, and I actually think the way I did it, thinking back now, I probably should have put stuff into I should have used this board seeder, like so that I should have put what I eventually do in the database seeder, I should have put in this seeder. I think that would have been better software design. And that's something maybe I would refactor if I was doing this for real. I might come back and refactor that at some point. But for now, like my focus with what I'm doing here is learning this new way of doing factories. It's not making an application that I'm going to use. So that's a very different thing. And I'm not doing this for coursework or something. And that's what, like, I think some people kind of forget, is that sometimes you need to just code to learn something rather than code to do something. And there is a difference there, and the way you work is different. And sometimes if you go straight to coding to do something, you don't do a very good job of learning, and then that's when you dig yourselves hole. So here, I'm creating factory. I make another mistake now, which is I don't put the two minuses, and I end up creating a really interesting factory that has like a weird, like if you look there, it's app models odl equals board. So what's happening here is that actually the way that option works is it's -m and then the model name. So it's thinking the model name is ODEL equals board. Like I fix it because I can fix it manually, but then like for future factories, I do it properly and don't have this issue. So what this has done is actually Laravel has now created a board factory for us. And in Laravel 8, what's different is that if you notice, the actual board classes have the kind of PHP classes and models have factories kind of associated with them. It's really good. It's really neat. I kind of like, I thought it was going to be more difficult to set up, but it was actually pretty straightforward for someone who's been working with Laravel for a while. So like, it's not, if you're new to it, it's going to be hard. So, okay, I'm going to board factory and I'm just kind of creating here at this point. I'm just following documentation. So I'm looking at the documentation and saying like, but I understand one thing that's important is I understand what Faker is and how Faker works. So it's okay. If I didn't, I would be looking up what Faker is, right? I'd be Googling that and figuring out that first. You shouldn't type anything, if you type a line of code you don't understand, you're gonna have a bad time. And that's, I can't stress that enough. You need to, every time you write code, you need to understand why you're writing it and what it does. If you don't, that will always come back to bite you. Always. So now, I've added, so all I've done, because I've used I added that mass assignment thing to the board.php. The factory is just like telling Laravel how to use the Faker library to create a new board. And because the board itself doesn't have a relationship, like the board belongs to, or to-dos belong to boards, right? In this example. So that's all I needed to do for the factory was just define that. Like for the factory for the board, I just needed to give it a name, and that was it. And what I'm doing here is thinking about where's the best place for me to put my factory line. And so maybe I do put it in. I think I start out by putting it in board seeder, which I should have stuck with, but then for whatever reason I ended up putting it in the database seeder. So I do actually leave it in here, or maybe I move it eventually. But okay. So what happened here is I looked at so I'd put that line in the board seeder. Then I went to database seeder and saw that the example they gave there was the user factory. But I'm starting to think that is just like they've written a user factory for you already. So I don't think I should have done this. I think I should have left it where it was and called board seeder from this thing. And so what's really cool about the way this, or what I think is cool about the way these factories work, is that I'm just calling the board class, and then because the board has a factory, I can just do factory 3, which tells it to create 3. That line tells Laravel to create 3 board models and add them to the database. The create puts them in the database, and so they persist. And now I'm just kind of looking for the function, like the command for running the for actually doing the seeding. And now that I've completed the seeding, I'm going to go to Tinker and just check that it works by grabbing some and checking there's stuff in the table. And there we go, it works. So I've got my 3. I was just checking that there was actually 3, that I did actually say I want 3, and it created 3. The next step then is to create the factory for the to-do items themselves, and this is where I know things are going to get a bit trickier. Well, firstly is I'd forgotten to set up my relationships in my classes, so that was the first thing I wanted to do, was to get that set up. Again, just kind of looking back at my notes. So I actually make another mistake here when I'm doing this, which is really easy to make. You know, like, so I did to-do board. Well, I'm just checking here that it hasn't changed for Laravel 8. So I'm like 90% sure it hasn't, but I just want to always double check that because I'm using a different framework than what I wrote my notes for. So I need to just check that. And then I think my mistake here is that I looked straight to as many, like I went has many. Whereas actually I got this the wrong way around. So a board has many to-dos, not the other way around. All right, I notice it before I try and use it, so that's good. But again, it's why it's important not to just copy and paste lines of code or just do it by rote. You have to be thinking, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And that's how you avoid bugs in the first place. And you really should be aiming to avoid bugs. Like, yes, you should be like, be comfortable with them, but you should. Bugs are almost always there because you made a mistake. Like, 99.9% of the time. So it's important that you understand what you're doing, and that's how I managed to spot this bug before I actually compiled the code, or before I actually did anything with it. And so I've put the inverse relationship in as well. And actually I've spotted, pretty sure I spotted a bug there that I didn't test. So that will, like, I actually didn't use the right case in my in that relationship. If you look, I lowercased the D into do, so I'm not sure if that would work. But I didn't actually I didn't check that, so maybe I'll go back and check it. Now what I'm doing is trying to look up how you do. So what I know, like I was already aware this idea that you can one of the key changes with factories is how you do relationships, is that you can, because a factory, like models have factories now, what we can do, which is really good, is you can create, like, for example, the example they give in their documentation is you could create a post or a user and say, I want to create a user with 10 posts. And because if you followed convention, Laravel knows it knows how the relationships are set up and through what tables and what foreign keys, so it can actually do the factory stuff for you, as long as you've got a factory defined for all of your models that you want it to automatically create. So my first step, and this is what I was kind of trying to figure out, is I need to make a factory for the to-dos themselves, so that when Laravel needs to call the factory for to-do, it does exist and it knows what to create in all the different fields. So you can see here that I've corrected that mistake I made earlier where I used the minus, I typed model rather than -m. So I won't get weirdness now. So now I've created the factory, I know that, like, everything's done now. I just need to add the figure out the correct syntax for doing the thing that I said earlier, where I want to create boards that have many to-dos. And so I'm just looking at so if you look on the documentation, you can do a thing where you say it has, so each factory has, and then you can pass the argument, basically pass a factory into a factory is what we're doing here. Now, what I'm wondering here is whether or not I need to use the create at the end, because I'm wondering, will this actually save these models into the database, or will it just create them locally and forget about it? And what I eventually figured out is that I think, well, I say I figured it out, and now I'm going to say I think. So because I have the create at the end of, because that factory, I think the create is at the end of this whole chain, so that will save everything that's happened within this call to the factory. So because I've got a create at the end, I don't need to put a create within the has call. So that's all set up. So now I'm just going to save and test it in Tinker. So again, I'm listing the commands and I'm making sure I'm doing it right rather than guess. Like I prefer to know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. So I'm wiping the database, destroying it all, and then starting from scratch. So I'm doing a migrate fresh. Again, I know I probably didn't need to put the fresh on there, but I tend to I'd rather overkill than underkill. And then yeah, I'm just gonna do the seeding and it works. And if I launch Tinker, I check and it's all there. So I hope this was useful, like following me through this process of learning something. Hopefully you'll get more than just how to do Laravel factories and Laravel 8 with relationships, but also more about how a process of development. And if you want me to do any more videos about this kind of stuff, let me know. And if I have time, I will try. But thank you for watching.